Welcome to our Gender Equality Talks. My name is AnaMaria Vargas. I'm the Research Director of the Swedish International Center for Local Democracy. I'm here together with Augusto Lopez-Claroz. He wrote a wonderful book called Equality for Women, Prosperity for All. We're having a series of talks about gender violence, about political representation of women, education and work and economic empowerment. And this is our last talk about cultural differences. So Augusto, we'll start now with the first question that we have for you. What do you make of the argument that different cultures have different values and that we should simply accept that in some countries, women would not be able to achieve gender equality because of these cultural differences?
Yeah, your question reminds me of an argument put forward by the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1990s, right, when they first took over. And if you will remember, women in the 1990s in that country had it very rough, right? I mean, there was no access to education. They could not work. The girls could not go to school. They had to wear the burqa, which is a particularly extreme example of covering and so on, right? And because of the discrimination against women, and in particular the lack of access to education for girls, there was a huge amount of international criticism of them. So much so that actually the United Nations Security Council issued a resolution around that time, condemning the Taliban and its treatment of women. And the Taliban put forward the argument that you have just mentioned, right? This is our culture, this is who we are. You have to respect our national preferences, the way we respect yours. We don't tell you how to treat your women, you don't tell us how to treat our women, right? And that argument sort of became known as the cultural exceptionalist argument, right? That we are different cultures, we should respect each other, and you don't tell me how to run my culture, right? Or my country. The flaw with that argument, right, and it is deeply flawed and ultimately a dishonest argument, is that, of course, in Afghanistan, it is the men, the Taliban, who appropriated for themselves the right to speak on behalf of the whole country, and without reference to the wishes of the millions and millions of women who were living in that regime. They never did a poll and asked women, would you like your girls to go to school? Because if they had done that poll, you would have discovered that the overwhelming response on the part of the women would have been, yes, we want our girls to go to school. If the poll had said, if you're a fully trained doctor, would you like to work? Or do you give us the right to tell you that you don't have the right to work, right? And the answer would have been, yes, we would like to have, women who have the skills and who can perform a role in the economy, to be able to work. Right. So as long as women have had their voices heard, right? As long as they have had a chance to actually say, yes, this is the way we would like to, we don't want to educate our girls, then that argument is okay. But that was not the case, right? So the culturally exceptionalist argument is based on the idea that we're just not going to give voice to the women. They're not free to express an opinion. We, the men, are going to decide what is Afghan culture. And our decision is that our culture is no education to women. And it's a tragedy that we see some of that coming back again, after the US left Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban is back in power and they are imposing restrictions on education again, so it's coming around full circle after more than 20 years, which is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because, the country has grown in population and it affects millions and millions of young people and girls in particular.
This argument of the cultural differences and the cultural relativism, it's very linked also to the work that we do. We are a Swedish NGO working in the Global South, where we hear, oh, these are ideas about gender equality. They are good for Sweden, but why should we take them here in Uganda or in Tanzania or in Colombia, where I personally come from? That this is a new form of colonialism, that is the feminism from these countries in the global north. And I know you have in your book an argument against that related to the diaspora that says, yeah, if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the data that I have shared with you, right? That, let me give you an example. The data that shows that when women work and they contribute to family income, more money is spent on education, more money is spent on public health, and so on. That data is not specific to high-income countries. A lot of developing countries come into that study, right? And so to suggest that encouraging women to work and to join the labor force is a kind of a Western imposition or an imposition from the global north to the global south, it's just not true. It's not true. I mean, we at the World Bank in particular, work with global data sets. The database that we have built up on discrimination against women in the law covers 190 countries. So yes, it includes New Zealand and Canada and Sweden, but it also includes Uganda and Guatemala and Tanzania and Bangladesh, right? And increasingly, this argument that we should have different rights for, the country depending on their location, north or south, it just doesn't go. Furthermore, let me remind you that, of course, the vast majority of countries in the world, in the north and in the south, including developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in other places, are not only members of the United Nations, which means that they have adopted the UN Charter, right, and the principles underpinning the UN Charter, which explicitly recognize gender equality, right? But they have also adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which goes into further detail as to the kinds of human rights framework that countries have adopted and accepted. So they can't have it both ways, right? They can't, on the one hand, be full members of the United Nations with a seat in the General Assembly and occasionally a seat in the Security Council on the one hand, right? Which means that they have adopted and accepted the principles of the UN Charter, and on the other hand say, oh, well, these principles of equality and access to education, access to the labor force, and so on and so forth are a Western imposition. No, they are principles which they have adopted, right? So if they don't like these principles, then they should withdraw from the United Nations. They should unsign the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on and so forth. But they won't do that because, I assure you, there would be massive opposition on the part of the population and civil society organizations and so on. The vast majority of people in the world would like to live under principles that guarantee equality, that guarantee protection under the law. And so very often, I hate to say it, but there is a great deal of hypocrisy on the part of many governments, who claim this, who make the case of cultural exceptionalism.
Thank you. Moving forward, another issue that links here to cultural issues is religion. Religion has played a role in discrimination against women. What are the consequences? How do we address what has been the role of religion?
I think that part of the problem we face here is one of, let's say, the inability of many religions to recognize that times have changed, societies have evolved, and that we live in a different epoch than when first the religion made its appearance, right? Some of the great world religions, I'm thinking Judaism, I'm thinking Christianity, I'm thinking Islam, they're ancient. Right? Ancient. They go back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years into the past. And very often in their origins, the concept of gender equality might have seemed somewhat alien, right, for the particular societies which existed at that time, right? Scholars have noted that, for instance, the Bible does not explicitly introduce a prohibition against slavery, right? Slavery was a feature of Christian societies for centuries, right, after the birth of Christianity. And one kind way to interpret that is that perhaps it was not seen as being timely, that societies and the economies of those periods were not yet ready to introduce in their principles the notion of full equality and freedom and so on and so forth. It was only in the 19th century that we finally walked away from slavery, and we recognized it for what it was, that we cannot impose lack of freedom on a particular sort of minority group. So I think it's the same with gender. I think that if you go back to some of the writings of, for instance, Tertullian, who was a kind of an early theologian of Christianity, or Saint Thomas, or even some of the writings or sayings attributed to Paul, one of the apostles, right? There is an element of misogynism there. There's no question about it. There's only, you can read some of these statements and you can recognize them for what they are, statements made a couple of thousand years ago or less, that perhaps reflected the values and the conditions of society at that time. But, times have changed, and we now live in the 21st century, and we cannot use arguments that are 2,000 years old, in the age of modernity, right? And I think that is where sometimes the tension arises, right? You see this in, every sort of so many years when the cardinals assemble in Rome to elect the next pope, right? And what is the first thing that you notice, other than their, very handsome red robes, right? Is the fact that they are all men, right? And so, but where does that come from? It comes from some ancient interpretation of, biblical sayings attributed to major figures in Christianity, right? But, again, I emphasize, we live in the age of modernity. We live in an age in which the notion of equal rights for men and women has universal acceptance by and large, and so we just need to address those tensions. And let me give you one more example that is also of a sort of a cultural nature. Whenever we publish the database at the World Bank that I have made allusions to in some of the other interviews, that compiles discrimination against women in 190 countries, sometimes I would be summoned to the office of the representative of some, Arab country, and they would complain to me about the database, and they would say, you are criticizing the existence of these discriminations against women without recognizing that many of these discriminations come from have a religious dimension. They have a religious origin. And so, in a sense, they would tell me, you are questioning the validity of these religious discriminations against women, right? And the answer to that question would be that when I look at the data across the countries that are from Islamic background, one of the things that is really interesting is to see that, yes, countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, are extremely restrictive. They have all kinds of discriminations against women in their laws. 15, 20, 21, 22, that we were able to identify. However, you look at countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, and you see a lot less. Still, there are discriminations. They're not New Zealand and Canada for sure, right? But they're a lot less than Iran and Jordan and United Arab Emirates, right? And so, how do you account for this? Because all of these countries claim to be Islamic in some form or other, right? And the answer to that question is that some Islamic countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, the others that I have mentioned, have been able to reconcile their beliefs, their religious beliefs, in a way that does not penalize women so much, right, than the others, than the Irans of this world, right? So within the same sort of religious background, different countries have adapted to the 21st century in different ways, right? And nobody can tell me that Malaysia or Indonesia is any less of an Islamic country than Iran or Saudi Arabia, right? And so that's an interesting fact in itself, right? That there is within a religious system some flexibility that allows to treat women in a less discriminatory fashion, and I think that's an interesting observation as well.
Thank you. Being Catholic, coming from a Catholic country like Colombia and living in Sweden, where there is a priest can be women, and many priests are actually women, has also made an impact on me because I see even that they do many times a better job. So if it's about merit, then who could be better advisor on many of these issues than a woman? So it's really penalizing religion, penalizing women, but also we could see that how these different cultures and religions could update themselves into modernity, as you said. Yeah, we have a couple more minutes. I know that you want to make some additional reflections about the issue of culture. One of the arguments that we also heard from countries that have many laws that discriminate against women is that they are actually not against women, they are to protect women. So that actually we should be thankful, because thanks to those laws, women are not raped or they are saved from the dangers of society. What do we say about that?
Yeah, I heard that argument before, actually. I remember meeting a very senior minister of the Russian government in 2016. And when I pointed out to him that in Russia, there were 456 occupations that were forbidden to women, he said to me, well, many of these discriminations are to protect women, right? And the idea being that maybe some of these occupations are dangerous, and therefore you don't want women to be involved in these jobs. But that argument is a bit ancient. It's a bit anachronistic, right? And let me give you an example, right? And this comes from Chile. It's a real world example, right? Chile, as you know, is a mining country, and I don't know whether you have ever seen the kinds of trucks that they use in the mines to carry the minerals. Yeah? They're huge machines, If you have ever seen a photograph of somebody standing by one of these trucks, a full-grown man is actually smaller than the diameter of one of the tires of the trucks. So there's these huge, enormous machines, right? And so many years ago, maybe 30 years ago, in Chile, these trucks could only be driven by men, right? And the implicit justification for this, of not making these jobs in the mines available to women, was that this was dangerous, right? That this required particular care, right? Then at one point, a private Chilean mine decided to open these jobs to women because they realized that the security argument actually was just not credible, right? Because these machines are highly technologically sophisticated. If you know how to drive them, you don't need to have strong muscles, because the machine being bigger, it requires greater strength. No, they're electronic, right? And so a child properly trained could probably drive one of these machines. what they did at this mine is they examined the safety record and the bookkeeping record of the female drivers with that of the male driver. And they discovered that actually the women were better drivers in terms of safety record, and they were also better bookkeepers because they need to keep track of the mineral that they have moved from the mine to the processing plant. And so there is some paperwork to be done. And the women were better on both fronts, right? So again, here you have an issue, right? That, you know, the safety, the protection argument was used for decades to basically prevent women from having access to a very high-paying job. And then one day somebody said, hey, this argument is actually not supported by the data. And they were able to prove that women actually were better drivers, right? So a lot of these protection arguments, you know, are very self-serving arguments. In the case of Russia in particular, they are arguments made by the men because they want to keep for themselves some of these very high-paying jobs.
Thank you, Augusto. I think that it shows us that we can change our culture and the way we understand religion and traditions by changing the laws that restrict. Is there any advice that you want to give to the local governments about the issues of cultural differences?
I think that, again, you know, many of the discriminations against women take place in a local context, right? Yes, the national law may discriminate against women in some fashion, right? But these get manifested at the local level in those first interactions, you know, within the context of local communities. And to the extent that local governments, you know, have responsibilities and jurisdiction over the application of the law, there is clearly a role for local governments, you know, to make sure that, you know, the law is applied equally to both men and women, and that where there are discriminations embedded in the national legislation, I think there is a role for local governments to challenge these discriminations.
Well, thank you so much. And we are going towards the end of this session on cultural differences and how we can address gender equality by looking at our different cultures. How can we enrich our cultures with gender equality? We want to thank all of you that have been watching us in these 4 episodes of gender equality. And we would also have the talks in Spanish for those of you that speak Spanish. Thank you so much, Augusto.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to talk to you.